1864. Abraham Lincoln states in the Gettysburg Address that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thus uttering the American doctrine of fighting for the interests of capitalist democratic societies and against the interests of non-democratic societies. A doctrine that later provides some U.S. justification for the Cold War and the arms race. Even before the guns stopped firing in Germany in 1945, the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the USA is crumbling. With over 8 million Russian soldiers dead from World War II, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin wants Germany crushed, economically and militarily, so that it will never again be a threat to the USSR. He also wants to establish pro-Soviet governments throughout Eastern Europe to protect the USSR from any future invasions. However, American President Harry S. Truman believes that only industrialization, democratic governments, and prosperity in Germany and throughout Europe will guarantee post-war stability. After the defeat of Germany, world leaders meet in Yalta to draw a new map of Europe. Unable to compromise or find common ground, the world's two remaining superpowers inevitably clash, and the era of the Cold War begins, so named because the USA and the USSR never fight each other directly. Instead, for the next 40 years they mount a never-ending war of propaganda and espionage, as well as supporting wars that take place in other countries. Germany is partitioned into 4 militarized zones, with the USSR controlling the east and the US, France, and Britain in control of the west. The Soviet Union annexes much of Eastern Europe, now known as the Eastern Bloc, and then in 1948 moves on Germany. The Soviet Union blocks railway, road, and canal access to those sections of Berlin under Allied control. Their aim: to force the Western powers to allow the Soviet zone to start supplying Berlin with food and fuel, thereby giving the Soviets practical control over the entire city. Instead, in what becomes known as the Berlin Airlift, Allied air crews fly over 200,000 flights in 1 year, providing up to 4,700 tons of fuel and food to Berlin. The success of the Berlin Airlift embarrasses the Soviets, and the blockade is lifted in May of 1949. Germany is divided into 2 separate German states, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The Cold War also includes political conflict and economic competition. This leads to espionage and the execution of spies for treason, and technological competition, such as the space race. The Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the first artificial object to orbit the Earth. As well, competition between the two sides leads to an arms race, in which astronomical sums of money are spent on military personnel, equipment, and weapons research. The biggest threat is the possible use of nuclear weapons, which could lead to destruction of the entire world. To justify the arms race, both countries use propaganda to paint the other side as monsters and antichrists and demons, while glorifying the aims of their own governments. In the US and USSR, citizens prepare for nuclear war and nuclear winter. Americans harness their entrepreneurial spirit, falsely believing that a nuclear holocaust can be survived by going underground. In 1956, the Korean War begins. in which the USSR arms and fights on the side of Communist North Korea, and the USA arms and fights with democratic South Korea. Other wars and crises follow, always with the superpowers weighing in. 1956, the Suez Crisis, or the Second Arab-Israeli War. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 is provoked by the USSR demanding the withdrawal of Western armed forces from West Berlin. The city is partitioned with the East German erection of the Berlin Wall, and people are shot for trying to escape from the oppressive living conditions of East Berlin. The threat of nuclear war is never more imminent than during the Bay of Pigs crisis and the blockade of Cuba ordered by President Kennedy. Over 2 million people died during the Vietnam War. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. In 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. The first steps towards détente, or the end of the arms race, are taken in the 1980s. Under outside pressure from Western powers and inside pressure of a failing economy, the USSR agrees to discuss ending the arms race. Pressure from within the Eastern Bloc continues to mount, and in 1989 the Berlin Wall falls. The Eastern Bloc follows suit, and by 1991 the Soviet Union itself has dissolved. But in spite of the end of the Cold War, nuclear proliferation continues. Russia, the USA, Great Britain, France, Israel, China, India, and Pakistan all possess nuclear weapons, with North Korea and Iran not far behind. Today, the U.S. alone spends $55 billion annually on nuclear weapons and related programs.